Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Getting to Know Each Other conference, Apprendre, connaître. Aujourd'hui, la présentation va être complètement en anglais. The whole presentation will be in English. Today we have Gordon Bloom, a full professor at McGill University in the Department of Kinesiology and Physical Education with 3 of his graduate students. And before I pass it along to him, I want to just begin by acknowledging that we're gathering today from the unceded Indigenous lands. Myself located in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, where the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodian of these lands and waters. So I'm aware it's an online conference, maybe not everyone's joining from Montreal. So I do invite you to use the chat box to share with us maybe where you're coming from and what communities or nations are maybe closest to you. A few Zoom technicalities before we begin. I do invite you to please turn off your microphones during the presentation, just so that we can give our full focus and attention towards the person that is speaking. And after, we'll have today 4 presentations, so quite packed, starting with Gordon and then moving on to the 3 graduate students. So we will have a question and answer period at the end of the 4 presentations. So save your questions. If you want to ask them in the chat along the way, feel free to. We'll collect all of that and address it at the end of the conference. Or at the end, you also have the option to use the little raise the hand function if you want to speak out loud. Depending on your version of Zoom, either you can find that function in the participants area or at the bottom of your screen under the reactions button. As you may have noticed already, this is a recorded presentation. So once it's done, we do place the conference on the CRIR website. So we invite you once it's up to still share it with people who maybe weren't able to join today. So without further ado, I pass it on to Gordon Bloom.
Thanks, Alita. Can you see this? Is it clear?
Yep, it's all good on my end.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to see the faces. I see a lot of familiar faces from McGill, from around Canada, and I even see a couple of our colleagues from far away. I saw Marta from Norway and Leah from Wales. So it's really wonderful to see everybody here, especially people who have done work in Parasport and have contributed to the learning that I've done. So what's going to happen today, I'm going to spend about the first 10 minutes just setting up sort of how we started to work in Parasport and some of our earlier studies and some facts and findings that have influenced our desire to study this topic. And then you're going to hear 3 different studies from 3 of my current graduate students, Danielle Alexander, Lara Palmer-Lofontaine, and Jordan Lefebvre. And we'll have some time for the questions at the end. And I want to also welcome all of my fellow CRIR members who are here. I'm a relatively new member to CRIR, so I think that's why I was asked to participate in this way. So maybe some collaborations will come out of today's presentation as well. So before we get going, let me just share with you or introduce to you sort of the philosophy or the program of research that we do in my lab at McGill. I guess we're in sports psychology, and I would summarize it as the knowledge, strategies, and behaviors employed by coaches in terms of leadership practices, mentoring, and team building that are designed to create a culture of excellence that includes the development of successful and well-balanced athletes. So we study coaching, and we study coaching in all different contexts. So we work on parasport coaching, but we also work in able-bodied coaching from the youth sport level all the way up to the Olympic, the Paralympic, and the professional level. I always put a shout out to the coach that had the biggest influence on me, which was John Wooden. He has a wonderful philosophy about developing the whole person, and it's really resonated with our lab. And I always like to put that is a picture of myself with him many, many years ago. But also in the parasport context, I've been very fortunate working at McGill. We have a parasport coach, Peter Carpenter, and a parasport athlete, swimmer Val Grand Maison, who've been to the parasport, the Paralympics, and Val has won numerous medals, gold medals. She's held world records, and I've learned a lot from the two of them. So thanks to both of them. So a little bit of background information on why we're studying this topic. There's over 1 billion people, or 15% of the global population, that report living with an impairment. In Canada, we have over 6 million adults, and 600,000 people in Quebec have reported having an impairment. As well, many of these people live with secondary conditions that affect their quality of life. Those with a physical impairment in Canada, well, less than 1% of these individuals all are involved in organized sport or physical activity programs. That is alarming, especially when you see the numbers for the able-bodied counterparts be 31%. So there's a huge disparity there. And I think it just reinforces the desire or the importance of seeing if there's ways we can study sport participation for individuals with a physical impairment. And again, in our lab, we look at people with physical disabilities, not intellectual disabilities. So the Paralympic Games, it's now become a worldwide event, right? It originally started, there was 400 athletes representing 23 countries. Recently, you had over 4,300 athletes representing 158 countries in Rio in 2016, and 567 athletes representing 49 countries in Pyeongchang. So the numbers are there. What about some of the research? Well, for me, looking at the research on coaching and coaching in parasport, I guess the first real document, particularly in North America, at least that I'm aware of, came from the US, and it came from the Committee on Sport for the Disabled that was created in 1985. This committee identified 7 key areas that needed research in disability sport or parasport. One included the selection of coaches, the effectiveness of coach training, and coaches' backgrounds. And it just so happens that really mirrors the research that we do in my lab. So that's good on that. It's good on that. Well, 10 years after this report, Greg Reed and Andrea Prupis, and Dr. Greg Reed was a fellow faculty member in our department at McGill in adaptive physical activity and a mentor for me in disability sport. And along with his graduate student, Andrea Prupis, in 1998, they documented and analyzed research publications from 86 to 96 related to those 7 research priorities. So you would think that the coaching would have significantly increased the research based on the original report. Well, they found only 5 of 204 database articles on coaching. And their quote was in 1998, the coaching area is in dire need of database research to assess the effectiveness of coaches' training programs. So you think maybe with both of these documents that things would start moving and research would start happening. Well, Lee and Peretta in 2013 published a similar analysis to Reed and Prupis for the time period 2001 to 2011. Their results found that there was not much research in sports psychology. Most of it was on physiology and biomechanics related to disability sport. And what's even more alarming is that when compared to the first time period analyzed by Reed and Prupis, both the frequency and number of database publications on the selections of training of coaches did not increase. So now you've got 3 sort of landmarks here saying we need more research, but nothing's happening. And there are consequences when there's no research. For one thing, people in parasport are getting all their information as decontextualized. So they're basically having to adapt the information from the able-bodied context to their own setting. In Canada, where we tend to be a world leader in coach education, up until 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have any coach education sources specifically in parasport for people with impairments. Now, we do have some now, and from what I know, we're at the top, or unless someone's recently created more coach education programs, we're still a world leader, but there's still less than 8 sports that have actual coach education training. We need more. Even though we're moving in the right direction, we still need more here in Canada. So my sort of conclusion is the need for empirical research within this population is undisputed, especially with the development of sporting opportunities and events for athletes with impairments. And it's sort of all of this information that I've presented has really been sort of the leader in getting me to do work in this area. So I'm going to spend about 2 more minutes just summarizing some of the work that we've done, and then I'll pass the microphone over to Danielle. The first study that we published was in 2007, and you remember I mentioned the name Greg Reed earlier. So he was a co-author on a study that we did with Carrie Cregan, looking at the progression of coaches of Paralympic swimmers. So it basically had a group of coaches who were coaching parasport swimmers, and we asked them a little bit about their knowledge and where they learned and how they coached. And to date, we've done some reviews. This is the first study that specifically looked at this topic. And what we found is that the first thing was these parasport athletes want to be coached like an elite athlete. Treat them like an elite athlete, coach them like an elite athlete. But the coaches also said, I think a lot of people have to get over the idea of, oh my goodness, what am I going to get into if I coach a swimmer with a disability? Again, you're coaching an elite athlete. The only thing that really did come up that's a little bit different was making sure that you had knowledge of the disability. That's the one thing the coaches said is we really have to learn about the disability. And the way that we do that is we talk to the athletes themselves and we learn from them what they can do, what they can't do, how they want to do it. And that's how you coach. You move on. So the conclusions from this first study, which again have influenced our subsequent studies in the last 15 years, we found that there weren't a lot of coaches that actually wanted to coach an athlete with an impairment. Many of Canada has a very inclusive swimming environment. Somebody with a disability shows up, then they get coached. And that's really what happened with a lot of our earlier parasport swimmers. We found that the first generation of coaches in our country were taking their coach education in able-bodied settings, so not settings tailored for parasport, and most of them were also elite able-bodied athletes themselves. So my conclusions are sport can provide a number of benefits for people with physical impairments. Much remains to be explored to fully understand the career development, the learning practices, the effective coaching skills of parasport coaches. We're a small community in Canada doing research, but it's nice that I see some of my colleagues from Windsor and Ottawa here who are doing work in these domains. We need to do more. And the one thing that I say, and this is sort of shout out for people that are career that are not in sports psychology, is we need multidisciplinary research. We need cross-cultural research. I know I have my colleague here from Norway and my colleague from Sweden sent his regrets. He wasn't able to make it, but we're trying to reach out with people, Danielle and I, to do more cross-cultural research. Let's make this a collaborative effort. Let's get everybody involved and find most effective ways to coach. Thank you. Danielle, you're next.
All right, thanks, Gordon. Screen share this. So everyone can see this. Get some nods, thumbs up, perfect, awesome. All right, so hi everyone, thank you, Gordon. My name is Danielle Alexander. I'm a third-year PhD candidate in the sports psychology lab at McGill. And I'm here to talk to you today about the first study of our dissertation, which looked at, or I guess we looked at, a media analysis conducted on parasport coaches over a 20-year time span. So diving right into it, the first question you might be thinking is, why the media? Why study that? Why is it important? And I would say the answer to that is that the media plays one of the largest roles in shaping our thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors. So we have a saying in sports psychology that what we think affects how we feel, which influences how we act. And although the media doesn't decide what we think, it does decide what we think about. And I think the best example I can give on this is watching the news. right? We watch the news, we get informed on a topic, and then suddenly this topic might interest us. It might anger us. It might make us sad or happy or whatever that emotion is. And we're more likely to think about it and talk about it with family or friends or whoever it is. So where does sport fit into all of this? It's because the media shapes what we consider to be normal in society. We might be a lot more used to seeing certain sports like hockey or football or soccer, for example, especially in North American society. But we also might be a lot less likely to be exposed to sports like archery or badminton or parasport, for example. So it also shows us what's considered to be valuable in society based on not only what's included, but also what's left out. So because of this idea, we know that the media has the potential to influence parasport or disability sport, depending on the way that it's portrayed. So for example, we look at this picture on the left here and the caption saying, "Don't look at the legs, look at the records." And while the intention might be pure from this, we do have to wonder, how does this athlete feel about the message that's being portrayed about their legs? So because of this influence that the media has on people, researchers have started to look at and conduct media analyses, but they focus specifically on the Paralympic Games or parasport athletes and how they've been portrayed, which is an excellent start. But there has been an oversight on parasport coaches and how they fit into this narrative, despite the fact that they play a really big role in raising awareness and providing education to parasport as a whole. So being a lab that specializes in parasport coaching at McGill, we've tried to be really inclusive about what the perspectives we're getting are. So for example, in my master's research, we talked to female Paralympic athletes on what they preferred in a coach. And in my next study, we're hoping to talk to Paralympic coaches. As you'll hear from Lara, she's going to be talking about how she interviewed athletes with acquired impairments. And then Jordan looked at parasport from all these different angles with athletes, coaches, rehab specialists, kinesiologists, and so on. So we felt like the media was a nice extension to all of this, of how we can acquire these different perspectives to get a better understanding of parasport as a whole. So it brings us to the purpose of our study, which was to examine how newspaper media portrays dominant discourses around parasport coaches over a 20-year time span. So the co-authors on this study were Dr. Bloom, who you just heard from, as well as Dr. Lindsay Duncan, who is also here today with her lab. In particular, we were interested in understanding what is the size and scope of these articles talking about parasport coaches. What are they saying about parasport coaches? So what type of language or discourses are they using? And then essentially, what does that mean? What are the implications for coaches or for the parasport community? So to do this, we use the LexisNexis academic database to get access to newspaper articles that were published from 1999 to 2019. We included articles if they were published in English, because we speak English, and that had some sort of discussion around either parasport coaches or Invictus Games coaches or Paralympic ones to get some sort of diversity in who we were looking at. So from here, we ended up with 282 articles, which was too many. So we then excluded articles, whether they talked about coaching in other contexts outside of sport. So some of them talked about business coaching, which was outside, or summer camp. So we tried to keep it specifically to sport. And then we also excluded articles if they were more stats-based and had like very limited discussion to them. So after these exclusions, we ended up with 83 articles from 66 different newspaper sources from 14 countries around the world. So this gave us an idea of that first research question, which was to look at what's the size and what's the scope. To take a look at the second research question, we first analyzed the data using a thematic analysis. So we figured out what was being said about these coaches and in what ways. And then to look at the third research question, we used a critical discourse analysis. And so I won't get into the details about this, but it looks at how the social, the political, and the cultural discourses were being used to talk about coaches in the media. And this was really the meat of the analysis. This was where we focused not only on what was being said, but how was it being said? And why does that matter? What are the implications and the outcomes of this language being used? And the interesting thing, or what I consider the interesting thing about media analyses, is that there's this potential to take a look at contrasting or contradictory narratives that are being presented. So two completely opposite messages, which makes the reader have to decide where they stand on the topic. So to give you a few examples of this, we actually found 3 opposing narratives being presented in the media. The first one was the way that journalists portrayed coaching athletes with impairments. So some of the articles were saying there is no difference to coaching athletes with and without impairments, whereas others were saying, no, there are actually some important considerations that coaches need to consider. Another theme talked about how journalists portray the coaches themselves. So some articles describe them as these really sweet, deserving people who provide a service to athletes with impairments, whereas others said, no, these coaches and athletes are just as competitive. They're just as determined as their able-bodied counterparts. And then the last one talked about the environment that the coaches were in. So some articles really emphasize the harsh reality of it, the barriers that coaches have to face in terms of equality, where others had a lot more of an optimistic feel. They were showing more about how much parasport has progressed over the years. So we know this is a lot. This would be too much to present today. So we are only going to be focusing on this first discourse, which is showing the perceptions of parasport coaching. So within this first theme, a lot of journalists, coaches, members of the community, they highlighted similarities in coaching athletes with and without impairments in terms of their physiological and psychological skill set. So in an opinion piece, for example, Mayor Clifford Lee, he stated that Paralympic athletes and their coaches are no different than their able-bodied counterparts, as their training, time and commitment, level of physical fitness, mental preparation, and dedication is the same. Journalists also use the voices of parasport coaches to strengthen this point. So for example, one used wheelchair basketball coach, his name was Dave Duripos. He talked about his athlete, Alex Hayward. He said, when he goes out onto the court, he's going to war. The only difference is the wheelchair. The competitive will and the desire is the same. So they're really bringing home this point that, yeah, sure, the equipment is different, but the equipment is also different in every single sport. Otherwise, it should be considered to be equal and to be the same. But then there were also articles that talked about the fact that, yeah, there are specific differences that we need to consider, particularly around the physical and the psychological intersection of the impairment. So for example, one journalist highlighted the experience of parasport coach Kramer and his Paralympic athlete Newkirk. So he said he sees much of the job as helping her manage the pressure that comes with that knowledge. And the knowledge was that she was going to be a Paralympic hopeful. Medal hopeful. So this is especially important because some days Newkirk's body won't allow her to have a good workout or a good race. If she gets upset about it, that can make her symptoms worse. Just imagine you're disappointed. It's a human thing we do, but then to her, it affects her physically. So here they're highlighting that the impairment really does play a role in how they coach and how they manage the pressures of being a Paralympian. And because of these considerations, coaches have also felt unprepared and felt like they lacked knowledge in order to properly coach their athletes. So because of this, we also saw coaches talking about trying to find that information for themselves. And the one example I want to highlight here is Karen Williams. She's a para swimming coach, and she said she never worked with an athlete with dystonia before. She tried to track down as much information on the condition as she could. It was very challenging, definitely for both of us, to learn about her disability. So we can see from these quotes that the media does seem to be portraying contrasting ideas of what it means to coach an athlete with an impairment, or how you should perceive them in relation to their able-bodied counterparts. And we've seen these themes come up before with Paralympic athletes, for example. They want to be thought of as elite performers. They want to be thought of as the same level as Olympic athletes. They don't want to constantly have this little asterisk beside their name that's saying, yeah, they're a really great athlete with an impairment. They just want to be considered equal. But in order to get there, there's still a lot of inequities that need to be addressed between able-bodied sport and parasport. And a few examples I can give on a societal level, people's attitudes towards impairment still need to improve. On an organizational level, in terms of the amount of funding that parasport gets in relation to able-bodied is not equal. And on a practical level, with regards to the amount of media attention that they may or may not have. So if we're going to preach this idea that we're all the same, these inequities do have to be addressed first. And then we've also seen that second theme come up before too, with coaches saying, well, there are unique considerations for athletes with impairments, especially when they've acquired them. So whether they've acquired them from a traumatic injury or for more, for example, which Lara is going to be talking about a bit more. So researchers have actually emphasized that there should be clinical psychologists present in the sporting environment in parasport so that they can help athletes who might be suffering with PTSD, for example, or other psychological issues. And although some people might think that acknowledging these differences isn't right or isn't proper, we've seen that disability researchers have argued that if we don't acknowledge these differences, we're never really going to work towards some sort of positive or practical change. So if we can see the differences in a respectful way, we can work towards enhancing their quality of life. Okay, so just to sum things up here, we see that the media is this powerful medium. It has the potential to influence people's perceptions of parasport in society. We also see that journalists play a really important role in shaping these messages. And sometimes we're seeing contradicting views or messages on the same topic. So we think that it's really important, one, for media consumers to be aware of this, but also to make sure that parasport coaches are part of this process in shaping the messages that we're reading, because we need to see a clearer picture of what the community needs. And then finally, we think that raising awareness to these issues in the media has the potential to not only increase the education of media consumers, but also to promote parasport around the world. So with that, I would like to thank you so much for listening, and I will pass the baton next to Lara.
Awesome, thanks, Daniel. So, a minute. There we go. Okay, so awesome. Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you today. So as Daniel already mentioned, my name is Lara. I am a second-year master's student at McGill University under the supervision of Dr. Gordon Bloom as well. So in line with today's presentation, I am going to be presenting my research that will be focusing on how to create a supportive environment from the perception of wheelchair basketball athletes. So quickly, impairment refers to a decrease of body function limiting one's physical and or mental abilities. So as Gordon already mentioned, there are many people all around the world that have an impairment. However, specific to this specific country, there are over 6 million people in Canada and 600,000 people in Quebec who have an impairment. So parasports, which are sports that are played by people with an impairment, have rapidly moved from a recreational level, for instance, in a hospital backyard in 1944, to a competitive level, for instance, the Stoke Mandeville Games in 1948, which would eventually become the Paralympic Games. So sports involvement has shown to have many benefits for people with an impairment, including, for example, an increase of well-being, as well as life satisfaction. In particular, research has demonstrated that these positive outcomes can be influenced by the coach-athlete relationship. So coach-athlete relationship is defined as thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are interrelated and shared between coaches and athletes. One researcher in our field, Dr. Sophia Jawed, conceptualized this relationship into the 3+1 Cs model, which encompasses the three Cs, closeness, complementarity, and commitment, as you can see on the screen. So first off, closeness refers to the affective component of the coach-athlete relationship and is felt through this feeling of trust and respect, basically, between coaches and athletes. The second component, which is commitment, refers to the cognitive element of the coach-athlete relationship and is basically based on the will of maintaining the relationship over time. The third construct, complementarity, refers to the behavioral component and really involves the feeling of cooperation between coaches and athletes. Later on, Jawed decided to implement the fourth construct, co-orientation. Co-orientation refers to the shared knowledge, interests, and goals between coaches and athletes. So taking together, it has been argued that the higher levels of these three C's leads to a positive coach-athlete relationship, while lower levels of the three C's leads to a negative coach-athlete relationship. And interestingly, research has demonstrated that the coach can influence the level of closeness, complementarity, and commitment. So in regards to parasport coaches, research has demonstrated that they really play an important role for providing an environment to parasport athletes that fosters their personal and athletic development. However, parasport coaches have highlighted that they face a great number of barriers on a daily basis, impeding their coaching practices. So for instance, parasport coaches have reported facing discrepancies regarding the amount of funding, accessibility to training facilities, as well as lack of availability of support staff in comparison of coaches of able-bodied athletes. Additionally, these coaches have reported facing many social barriers, including stigma, discrimination, and prejudice, which is thought to be due to the mentality that parasport is considered the sub-elite of able-bodied sports. Furthermore, parasport coaches have reported facing a large number of responsibilities that were unrelated to the head coaching position. Such responsibilities included taking on the role of an assistant coach, being a fundraiser, a nutritionist, a mechanic, a manager, a recruiter, a trainer. Even some coaches reported having to coach many athletes with different athletic classification. So all this large number of responsibilities basically requires coaches to have a great deal of knowledge on parasport coaching. So this is why these coaches have highlighted the importance of having formal learning opportunities, such as online classes and workshops, to really help them to develop their coaching knowledge. However, parasport coaches have reported that formal opportunities are really expensive and lacks accessibility, forcing them to rely on informal learning opportunities. So I think what we can conclude with this is that parasport coaches do need additional formal learning opportunities to help them to develop their parasport coaching knowledge and further support our parasport athletes. So on the other side, parasport athletes also face a great deal of barriers. So for instance, parasport athletes identified that the high cost of specialized equipment, the poor access to transportation, as well as the lack of friendly disabled facilities were actually impeding or affecting their development. So parasport athletes actually argued that these barriers create a separation between parasport and non-parasport athletes. However, despite the social and environmental barriers, research has demonstrated that parasport athletes can in fact benefit from a supportive environment, which has been highlighted by the study that was conducted in our lab by Taus et al. In 2012. So the authors basically interviewed 4 elite wheelchair rugby coaches on their experience of being a parasport of athletes who had an acquired disability. They found that parents, volunteer, as well as the integrated support team, which included a nutritionist, physiotherapist, as well as sports psychologist, really contributed to the holistic development of parasport athletes by providing a support on the nutritional rehabilitation as well as training level. So as you can see, there is an increase of empirical research on parasport athletes. However, it has been noted that a little bit like what Daniel mentioned is that there is really a limited information on the perception of parasport athletes on how to create a supportive environment. So this leads us to the purpose of this study, which was to explore the parasport athletes' perception on how coaches created a supportive environment. This study was co-authored by my dear friend and colleague, Daniel Alexander, as well as my supervisor, Dr. Gordon Bloom. So for this research, we recruited 6 participants that had at least acquired the impairment for a year, around a year before data collection. They were either current or retired wheelchair basketball athletes who competed at the provincial or national level. Finally, they were either male or female athletes over the age of 18. So to collect our data, we conducted 2 separate interviews. So for the first interviews, timelining was implemented in order to really encourage our participants to share their experiences when they acquired their disability. So I would tell you that specifically during a pandemic time like right now, this interview was really helpful to establish a first contact, develop a relationship with the participant, as well as learn a little bit more with them. So it was really helpful. For the second interviews, we conducted a semi-structured interviews based on an interview guide that we've created. And prior to these 2 interviews, I personally collected documents, including participants' biographies and previous athletic record, to get a better understanding and learn more about the participants. All the data were basically analyzed using a thematic analysis. So following this analysis, 3 main results appeared and will be discussed in today's presentation. It included equipment, coach adjustments, as well as understanding optimal athlete functioning. So for equipment, athletes express the importance of having coaches who help them with their equipment. So for example, athlete 5 highlighted, you could have a very, very different experience as a one-point player if they sit you in the wrong chair and you do not have a strap. You just feel unbalanced and hopeless. Whereas if you sit in a chair that fits you and is appropriate, the coach can give you a little bit of advice on that front. It can go much, much better. It is actually a pretty big deal. So moving forward to coach adjustments, athletes discuss the importance for coaches to adjust their practices based on their own abilities. So for example, athlete 1 said, when the coach makes a training practice, the coach tries to match up a player with a low and high classification together to teach them how to work together. They, the bigger players, see the small players have a harder time to get the ball and to be balanced. These drills increase the team cohesion. Finally, regarding understanding optimal athlete functioning, athletes highlighted the importance for coaches to be very understanding and knowledgeable. This was demonstrated by athlete 1, who mentioned, my coach knew what I was going through when I started playing and why I was frustrated. The big players were shooting 30 points a game and I was not touching the ball for 40 minutes. He was like, do not focus on them, focus on you, on what you do for the big players, because they are going to be the ones shooting. I felt understood by my A-level coach and I felt that he knew what he was talking about. Athletes also discussed the importance for coaches to be attentive and, of course, to provide a supportive environment. As athlete 4 mentioned, I think that having a supportive and safe coach helped me to continue playing wheelchair basketball. In hockey, I have never had that experience. So in basketball, I immediately felt good. I felt listened to, comfortable, and important. Finally, athletes highlighted how they benefited from having a coach who had previous parasport experience. So athlete 4 highlighted, my first coach was a parasport athlete, and I think that it changes everything because he understands what we are going through. He understands when we are angry because we cannot do something. He knows what is going on because he is an athlete. So taken together, you can see that these results contribute to a small body of knowledge regarding effective parasport coaching practices. So in this study, specifically, athletes identified effective coaching behaviors such as being knowledgeable and understanding that contributed to a supportive environment. Moving forward, we would recommend future research to look at the perception of coaches on how to create a supportive environment. And we also believe that it would be interesting to explore the coach-athlete relationship and to see how this interrelated and interdependent relationship influence the creation of a supportive environment. Thank you. I will pass on to Jordan.
Thank you, Laura. All right, bonjour tout le monde. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Jordan Lefebvre. I'm in the final year of my PhD, and today I will be presenting one of my dissertation studies, examining the impact of personal relationships on the athletic development of parasport athletes. So for the last 45 minutes, you've heard from Gordon, Danielle, and Lara about the important role of coaches in the parasport environment. However, there is a more emerging support that parasport athletes rely on a number of other individuals as well, and this can include peers, coaches, and parents. So for instance, there's preliminary support to suggest that peer mentors play an important role in the sport experience of athletes with an impairment. Specifically, peer mentoring is a peer interaction that aims to provide encouragement, counsel, and information to individuals who share similar lived experiences. So not only is there a need to further examine the wide scope of personal relationships that contribute to the development of parasport athletes, there's a need to understand how these relationships in combination contribute to the development of parasport athletes. So with this in mind, one interesting framework is the developmental network perspective, which assumes that a person acquires a developmental network of concurrent developmental relationships. And that can incorporate peers, coaches, and family at once. Now, within this framework, these relationships are considered developmental agents, which are the set of people a mentee, or in this case, an athlete, names as taking an active interest in and action to advance the athlete's career by providing developmental assistance. In other words, it's the people who contribute to the development of an athlete. So with this in mind, the purpose of the study is to examine the developmental networks of parasport athletes. We had a number of specific research objectives as well. This included, well, who do parasport athletes consider to be their developmental agents? How much support is provided by the developmental agents? And finally, in what ways do developmental agents contribute to the development of parasport athletes? And to address these objectives, we used a mixed methods case study. And so before I dig deeper into the methods, I do also want to take a moment to recognize my three co-authors, who are all members of CRIR as well. And this includes Danielle and Gordon, who you've heard from today, as well as Dr. Shane Sweet, who also works here in our department at McGill. So the case within this study was one local parasport team, and this included 7 athletes, of which 5 were male and 2 were female. Of the 7, 5 of these athletes had an acquired impairment, specifically a spinal cord injury, and 2 of these athletes had a congenital impairment. The participants also included 7 non-athletes to provide additional contextualized information. And this included 4 male and 3 female non-athletes. And these non-athletes were 1 coach who was also the romantic partner of one of the athletes, 3 parents, 1 kinesiologist, and 2 administrators. We had 3 methods of data collection, and the first was a participant observation, which involved observing the participants before, during, and after each training session. Each observation lasted about 2.5 hours for a total of 15 hours of observation. The purpose of these observations was primarily to build rapport with the participants, but also to have a better understanding of the environment itself, and also to identify and observe the developmental relationships in action. The athletes were also asked to complete a questionnaire, and this involved 2 phases. The first phase was name generation, where athletes were asked to identify their developmental agents. Next, in the name interpretation phase, athletes were asked to rate the developmental impact of each of these developmental agents on a 3-item scale. So as an example, here's the developmental network of athlete 1, who included 6 developmental agents: mother, father-in-law, romantic partner, sister, mother-in-law, and stepfather. We then conducted semi-structured interviews with each of the athletes, and the purpose of this was really to dig a bit deeper and to describe each relationship, as well as to describe in more detail the developmental contribution of each relationship. The quantitative data was analyzed using social network analysis, which is essentially a set of algorithms that allows us to visualize and describe the developmental network. Doing so included a number of specific measures, which I'm going to describe in more detail along with the results to try to make it a bit more sensitive. The qualitative data was analyzed using thematic analysis to identify the themes and sub-themes within the data. So this is the Parasport Development Network, and it consisted of 37 nodes and 42 edges. The 7 athletes, which you can see here, as well as all of their developmental agents, are represented by the circles, and these are known as nodes. The developmental relationship, so the connection between two people, is represented by the lines, which is also known as edges. So the first research question was to identify the Parasport athletes' developmental agents, and in total there were 34. Of these, 12 were family members, and this included parents, step-parents, mother or father-in-law, as well as siblings. 4 of these developmental agents were romantic partners. 9 were teammates. Some of these teammates were in the current team itself, whereas some of them were former or current teammates from other teams, such as the provincial team or the international team, or the national team, sorry. 6 of the developmental agents were coaches. This included the current coach, former coaches, and the national team coach. And lastly, the athletes also nominated 4 rehabilitation specialists as developmental agents. Now remember that this is a sport development network, which means that the athletes felt rehab specialists contributed to their development as athletes, which was interesting. These specialists included kinesiologists, occupational therapists, and physiotherapists. So we used a measure of what's called out degree centrality, which is simply the number of outgoing arrows per person. This was used to identify the number of developmental agents for each athlete. So with this in mind, each athlete averaged 6 developmental agents within their individual networks, which range between 3 and 9 across athletes. Next, 3 measures were used to examine the second research question, which was how much support is provided by the developmental agents. So the first measure, in degree centrality, represents the number of incoming arrows. In other words, how many times were each person identified as a developmental agent? So within this network, a person was nominated on average 1.14 times, ranging from never, not at all, up to 5 times. The in-degree score also corresponds to the size of the circle. So the bigger the circle, the more times a person was nominated. Second, the strength of tie represents the amount of developmental contribution between 2 individuals. This corresponds to the width of the arrow. So the wider the arrow, the greater the contribution. Now, more importantly was the weighted in-degree score. By combining both in-degree and strength of tie, this measure allows us to consider the overall contribution of each individual to the network as a whole in order to identify the most important developmental agents within the team. So for instance, the top 3 contributors included athlete 7, the current coach, who again is also a romantic partner, as well as 1 kinesiologist. What we then did is we averaged the weighted in-degree scores across type of developmental agent. And what we found is that local teammates, romantic partners, and coaches appeared to be the top developmental contributors. A few things we also want to highlight that was, although unexpected, is we were pleased to see that athletes felt rehab specialists that have played an important role, but also that although coaches are clearly important, we expected their contribution to be a bit greater. So we turned to the qualitative data to explore these findings in a bit more depth. So with that in mind, we used the qualitative analysis to address the third research question, which was, in what ways did the developmental agents contribute to the development of these athletes? So the thematic analysis identified 3 overarching themes. The first theme was integration into community, which included rehab specialists and local teammates as contributors to this theme. The second theme was facilitating parasport continuity, which primarily involved families such as parents and siblings and romantic partners as contributors. And finally, athletic development, which included local teammates, non-local teammates, and coaches as contributors to this theme. So to dig a bit deeper into each one, the first theme, integration into the community, involved the rehab specialists, who primarily were contributed by promoting an active lifestyle and helping spinal cord injuries with the rehabilitation. But specific to the sport context, what they did is they were highly involved in actually fostering the integration of each athlete into the parasport environment, which was of value to these athletes. As an example, athlete 5 said, kinesiologist is amazing. Till this day, she still brings new guys. And it's not even part of her job. She does it outside of her job, outside of her working hours. Teammates also played a really important role. They actively went out and recruited new athletes, and they played an important role in helping the teammates feel included once they arrived into the community, into the sport community. They also provided support. As an example, athlete 7 said, the first time I saw athlete 1, he had been in rehabilitation for 5 months, and he had almost fully recovered from his injury. So I figured I would get him out on the court. I tried to support him. I wanted to make sure he was in a position where he could enjoy himself. I wanted him to have a good chair, good equipment. Next thing you know, he was coming to tournaments outside the country. Now, the second theme was facilitating parasport continuity. And this was done primarily by the family and romantic partner, where they provided tangible support, such as financial aid, transportation to practices and games and tournaments, and even mechanical support, because the wheelchair would break all the time. And so without this support, it would be very difficult for these athletes to continue to participate on a regular basis. Current coach and romantic partner said, when they start out, they are not that competent at transferring. And they are also worried about being transferred by people they don't know. So I think if I wasn't there, I don't see how athlete 6 could have done it. And it's true for all players. If there isn't a parent or a girlfriend or whatever, people don't really come back as often as if they do. The third and final theme, athletic development. To emphasize the deal with coaches here is when we dig a little bit deeper, what we found is that coaches were a little bit limited in the amount of support they could provide directly to the athletic development due to the lack of experience they had and a lack of learning opportunities that were presented to them. And so for this reason, coaches were not at the top of the source of athletic development. They were primarily responsible for creating a much needed structure to practices and games. However, this was emphasized as very important within this context. So the current coach and romantic partner described, I think the main benefit for them right now is to have a bit more structure in their practices. Before I came in, practice would quickly turn to scrimmage for like the whole 90 minutes. They were really just socializing, and so they were not necessarily getting the most out of their development. And then teammates were actually the primary source of development as an athlete itself. So teammates were responsible for helping their peers learn the foundation of the sport, like how to hold the ball, how to throw the ball, how to wear your equipment properly, that kind of thing. But I really want to emphasize athlete 7 here, because due to his access to the national team, he would then gain really important, really privileged knowledge, which he would then bring back to the team. And he also served as an advocate for promising athletes to try to get them involved in the national team. So athlete 5 described how athlete 7 was on the national team. So he was getting privileged information, advanced strategies and everything. He came back and acted like a leader by sharing information with us. And, you know, I think that just helped everybody else progress and evolve and improve exponentially. So to finish off, just a few takeaways. The developmental networks of parasport athletes include a diverse range of developmental agents, and these developmental agents provided unique developmental contributions. So family and rehabilitation specialists played a really important role in the maintenance and growth of parasport. Peers were the primary source of sport development, such as knowledge acquisition, and coaches might require great opportunities for coach learning, such as mentoring and coaching workshops. And this is consistent with what Danielle, Gordon, and Lara were talking about. And this access to these opportunities may help maximize their developmental contributions in the future. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you to all of our presenters, Jordan, Lara, Danielle, Gordon. I think you gave us a nice teaser. I know it's definitely not all of the details, but super interesting. We packed a lot in the 1 hour time slot. We do have time for a few questions, so I invite you to put that in the chat. I've also just placed in the chat a link where you can find other upcoming conferences and events from CRIR, as well as my email address if ever you have any questions. Let's go straight to the first question that came in just after Gordon's presentation from Claudine Auger, co-scientific director at CRIR. Do you see links with equity, diversity, inclusion, the new committee of CRIR?
Yeah, I think we're doing some of that research as well. Danielle, did you want to comment on that a little bit or no?
Yeah, well, I've seen a lot of really interesting opportunities for research grants and research proposals coming in. So if that's the same aspect that we're talking about, 100%, I think it's needed research. And I think it's something that people are, at least in the last 10, 20 years, people are really starting to take a look at now. So I think it fits nicely.
We also have Dr. Lindsay Duncan, who's a co-author on one of our studies and does a lot of work in this area. And she's here with her lab. And there is research in that area going on in our department, not only in our lab, but through Lindsay and some work in Shane Sweet's lab as well.
Just to bounce off of that, the committee that Claudine is speaking about is something very new at CRIR that we're starting to put together. So I don't know if anyone of those individuals that you just mentioned are maybe already solicited their interest in being part of this committee at CRIR to see how we as a research center can help create and implement best practices in this area. So I invite you to reach out if you're able to partake in that committee. We also have another comment from Claudine. I'm not sure, Claudine, do you want to speak?
I think with the time we have, maybe some of you read my comment in the chat. We're just thinking that it was very interesting just to hear about the methods, and we see that there may be a need at CRIR to have like discussion table about methods. So I thought it was very interesting to see the network analysis and how it may apply in other labs. So maybe you can answer to us by email after the meeting if you see some interest to go further in some methodological approaches, so to see how we can link across labs and across sites. So I thought, this was very nice to see your approach. So, but because of the time, I guess you cannot really answer all the group, but let us know by email if you'd like that.
Yeah, we certainly will. And one of the things we tried to do today in this presentation was give 3 different studies that had 3 very different methodologies. So you weren't getting just one and done. And we do a lot of mixed methods research in our labs. So we'll be happy to talk to you further about that. Thank you, Claude. Thank you, Claudine.
Some other comments of praise. You definitely stuck to your word of being a well-flowing group of presentations. So thank you for that. If there are any other questions that are pressing, feel free. While you're thinking, I will mention that, of course, listening to your presentations, there's, I think, ample opportunity for different partnerships or collaborations. In one presentation, it was mentioned around having clinical psychologists around the table. Also, Danielle, in your presentation around media, super interesting, curious. Actually, I'll just ask that as a question. Do you work with any media partners in advancing that question of how to present to the general public?
This is a really new field for me. So I've just started to get into the media analysis and the media in general. And I know that it's really important, but it's also a big gap that we've seen. Again, we always talk about theory to practice gaps and how can we take what we've learned and implement it in real life. And I think that's something that we're still working on, and the media is something that I think we can look to in the future.
Mhm.
I know that with AlterGo, I'm not sure if you're already in contact with that organization, but they also are working with a group of organizations in the community to try and come up with some common messages around different accessibility messages. That's a really poorly grammatically formulated sentence, but so it could be an interesting space to continue that discussion as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions, again, I invite you to follow up by email and keep in touch for the next activities. I leave you be.
Thanks again for everyone.